Victor Harrington believed that humiliating the quiet woman in the corner would be the most entertaining moment of the afternoon. But within minutes the prestigious academy would fall into a silence none of his students would ever forget. The New York Metropolitan Vocal Conservatory stood like a monument to ambition on the Upper West Side, its tall windows reflecting the late afternoon sun across polished marble floors that had carried decades of rising opera stars. Inside Studio B, the air carried the familiar mixture of piano notes, nervous breathing, and the quiet pressure that came from performing in front of one of the most demanding instructors in the country. Victor Harrington stood near the grand piano in his tailored charcoal suit, arms crossed with the casual authority of a man who had once commanded opera houses from Milan to Chicago. Even in retirement from the stage, his reputation remained intimidating. Students whispered about his impossible standards and his sharp tongue that could dismantle confidence in seconds. In front of him, a nervous soprano named Lydia Grant struggled through the opening measures of a notoriously difficult aria from Verdi, her voice wavering as she attempted to reach a high note that refused to cooperate. The room felt tense as the note cracked slightly, and Lydia stopped mid-phrase, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment while several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victor exhaled slowly and tapped the edge of the piano with a polished finger. "That aria," he said in a measured voice, "is not something you negotiate with. It is something you command." Lydia nodded anxiously, but her throat tightened, and the next attempt collapsed even faster than the first. A ripple of awkward silence passed through the class. Victor's gaze drifted across the room as if searching for something more interesting than the failed performance unfolding in front of him. That was when his eyes landed on the quiet woman standing near the back wall beside a card of sheet music. Emily Carter had been part of the conservatory staff for nearly a year, though few students could recall ever hearing her speak more than a polite greeting. She wore a simple navy cardigan over a white blouse and comfortable shoes that made almost no sound on the polished floor as she moved between rooms organizing scores and cleaning rehearsal spaces. To most people, she blended into the background the way stagehands do during an opera performance, present but invisible. Yet Emily had been standing there for the entire class, listening as she quietly sorted stacks of music into careful piles. Victor tilted his head slightly, a thin smile forming as an idea crossed his mind. The room needed a lesson, and sometimes a little demonstration made the point better than another lecture. He gestured toward Emily with theatrical calm. "Since our soprano seems to need a moment," he said loudly enough for every student to hear, "perhaps someone else would like to show us how it should be done." A few students glanced toward the back wall in confusion before realizing who he meant. Victor's smile widened just enough to signal that this was meant to be amusing. "Miss Carter," he continued, "why don't you come forward and sing the aria for us? You've been listening carefully all semester. Surely some of it must have rubbed off." A few students exchanged awkward looks, unsure whether to laugh, but one quiet chuckle escaped from the front row. Emily paused with a sheet of music in her hand and looked toward the instructor, her expression calm and unreadable as the entire class turned to watch the woman everyone assumed had no place anywhere near the stage. For a brief moment, no one in the studio moved. The soft hum of the piano lights and the distant echo of another rehearsal down the hallway filled the silence. Emily Carter stood beside the card of sheet music with the same calm expression she had worn all afternoon, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of a stack of scores. Several students exchanged glances, unsure whether the teacher was serious or simply making a point about discipline and confidence. Victor Harrington waited patiently near the piano, clearly enjoying the tension that had settled over the room. His reputation had been built on moments like this, moments where pressure exposed weakness and forced students to confront their limitations. "Miss Carter," he repeated with polite formality that carried a sharp edge of amusement, "the aria is already open on the stand. Please come forward." The room remained quiet as every pair of eyes followed the simple woman near the back wall. Emily hesitated only for a second, then placed the sheet music she had been holding neatly onto the cart. Her movements were unhurried, almost careful, as if she were finishing an ordinary task rather than responding to the attention of an entire conservatory class. She stepped away from the wall and began walking across the polished floor toward the front of the room. The sound of her shoes was soft but clear in the quiet studio. Some students leaned back in their chairs, curious now, while others hid small smiles behind their notebooks. To them the situation felt obvious. A staff assistant being asked to perform an advanced Verdi aria in front of a class of trained vocalists could only end one way. Victor watched her approach with folded arms and a patient expression. In his mind, this was a harmless lesson about preparation. The conservatory was not a place for daydreaming or silent observers. Everyone who stood inside those marble halls needed to understand how difficult real opera truly was. Emily stopped a few feet from the grand piano. The open score of the aria rested on the stand beside Lydia, who quickly stepped aside with visible relief that the attention had shifted away from her. Victor gestured toward the music with a polite motion. "It begins on the second page," he said. "Take your time." The class settled deeper into their seats, anticipating a brief and awkward attempt that would end with polite laughter and another lecture from their demanding instructor. Emily looked down at the score. For a moment, she simply studied the printed notes as if reading them for the first time. The room felt unusually still now. Even the students who had been whispering earlier had fallen silent, curious about how far this strange demonstration might go. Victor glanced at the clock on the wall, already expecting the experiment to last no more than a few seconds. Yet something about the quiet woman standing beside the piano felt unexpectedly composed. Emily lifted one hand and gently turned a page of the score, her eyes moving calmly across the notes with a focus that was difficult to read. A student in the front row leaned toward a classmate and whispered that the situation was about to become very uncomfortable. Another student quietly raised a phone as if hoping to record the moment for amusement later. Victor finally nodded toward the pianist seated nearby. "Let us give Miss Carter a starting note," he said lightly. The pianist pressed a single key on the grand piano, and the clear tone floated through the room. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, as if listening to something only she could hear. The clear piano note lingered in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Emily Carter slowly opened her eyes again, her gaze resting on the sheet music in front of her. Around the room, several students leaned forward, expecting the hesitation of someone unfamiliar with the complexity of what lay on the page. The aria was famous for its demanding opening phrase, a passage that even trained singers approached with caution. Victor Harrington stood beside the grand piano with patient confidence, already preparing the gentle correction he would offer after the inevitable struggle. He believed the moment would end quickly and harmlessly, another reminder to his class that opera was not a hobby, but a discipline built through years of relentless training. The pianist waited quietly with hands poised above the keys, glancing between the instructor and the woman standing beside the music stand. Victor gave a small nod, signaling the accompaniment to begin. The first chords filled the studio with the rich resonance of Verdi's composition, echoing softly against the tall rehearsal hall ceiling. Emily did not move immediately. She listened carefully, allowing the rhythm to settle into the room. The students watched with growing curiosity as the quiet assistant who usually arranged sheet music now stood in the center of their rehearsal space, with a composure that felt almost unusual. Victor folded his arms again, his expression calm but faintly amused. This, he assumed, was the moment when nerves would reveal themselves. Instead, Emily took a slow breath, the kind of breath that experienced singers use to prepare their voice before the first phrase. Her shoulders remained relaxed and steady. The piano reached the cue where the vocal line should begin. For a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then the first note left her voice. It was clear, steady, and unexpectedly powerful, filling the rehearsal studio with a tone that carried easily to the far wall. Several students straightened in their chairs as the sound resonated through the space. The note was not uncertain or strained. It was controlled, warm, and perfectly placed within the music. Victor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had expected hesitation or nervous laughter, but the voice that emerged from Emily Carter sounded nothing like someone attempting an unfamiliar melody. The phrase continued smoothly into the next measure, the Italian lyrics flowing naturally with precise diction that surprised even the pianist accompanying her. A student near the front lowered the phone they had raised earlier, suddenly unsure whether the moment was amusing at all. The room that had been waiting for an awkward failure was now completely silent except for the music. Emily moved into the next musical line with the same calm focus she had shown when organizing sheet music only minutes earlier. Her voice rose gracefully through the passage that had troubled Lydia before, the high notes ringing with clarity that seemed to float above the piano accompaniment. The shift in atmosphere inside Studio B was unmistakable. Students who had expected a brief demonstration now watched with wide eyes, their earlier smiles fading into quiet disbelief. Victor Harrington remained beside the piano without speaking, his attention fixed entirely on the performance unfolding in front of him. For the first time since the class began, the confident instructor who had orchestrated the moment appeared genuinely uncertain about what he was hearing. The final note of the phrase carried through the rehearsal hall with effortless control, lingering in the air long after the piano chord beneath it had faded. No one in Studio B moved. The reaction was not immediate applause or excitement. Instead, it was something far rarer in a conservatory filled with ambitious performers. It was pure silence. Emily Carter continued into the next line of the aria with calm precision, her voice shaping each Italian vowel with the kind of clarity that usually came only after years of disciplined vocal training. The pianist glanced briefly at Victor Harrington, searching for some signal that the demonstration should stop, but the instructor did not move. His arms were no longer folded. They hung loosely at his sides as his attention remained fixed on the woman singing in front of the class. The students who had been whispering earlier now leaned forward in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced by a growing realization that something extraordinary was happening in front of them. Emily's voice rose again through the next passage, reaching a sustained high note that filled the room with effortless resonance. The tone was not forced. It expanded naturally through the space, as if the acoustics of the hall had been designed specifically for it. A student near the back slowly lowered their notebook onto their lap, without looking away from the performance. Another student who had once studied in a regional opera workshop whispered quietly that the control in that note sounded like something heard only on professional stages. The pianist, now fully focused on the music, followed Emily's phrasing carefully, adjusting the tempo with instinctive respect for the singer leading the interpretation. Victor Harrington remained completely still beside the grand piano. For a man who had spent decades evaluating voices, the details unfolding in front of him were impossible to ignore. The breath support was steady. The phrasing revealed deep familiarity with the structure of the aria. Even the subtle emotional shading within the melody suggested someone who had performed the piece many times before an audience rather than someone encountering it for the first time in a classroom. Emily moved gracefully into the most demanding section of the aria, the same sequence that had caused Lydia to struggle earlier. The line climbed upward across the musical staff with increasing intensity. Several students shifted in their chairs as they anticipated the difficult transition into the final high register. The moment arrived, and Emily's voice rose into the note with remarkable ease. The sound rang through the rehearsal hall, bright and powerful, yet completely controlled. The effect on the room was immediate. A few students exchanged stunned glances, their expressions asking the same silent question. Who exactly was the quiet woman they had assumed was only responsible for organizing sheet music and preparing rehearsal spaces? Victor Harrington's expression had changed entirely now. The faint smile that had once signaled amusement had disappeared, replaced by the focused stillness of a professional listener who understood that something far more significant than a classroom demonstration was unfolding. Emily continued singing without any sign of hesitation, her voice carrying the emotional arc of the aria toward its closing phrase with the confidence of someone who understood every nuance of the music. By the time she approached the final cadence, the atmosphere in Studio B had transformed completely. The room that had expected an awkward lesson now felt like a small concert hall where every listener was holding their breath, aware that they were witnessing a performance none of them had anticipated. Emily's voice carried into the final passage of the aria. With unwavering control, each note flowing into the next with the calm assurance of someone who had long ago learned to trust both the music and her own breath. The pianist followed her phrasing instinctively now, no longer treating the moment as a classroom exercise, but as a true performance unfolding in front of them. The last musical phrase approached slowly, the melody rising once more before settling into the closing cadence that demanded both strength and elegance from the singer. Emily lifted the final line with remarkable ease, sustaining the note with a warm resonance that seemed to fill every corner of Studio B. When the final chord from the piano faded, the silence that followed felt deeper than before. For several seconds no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that only appears when people realize they have witnessed something entirely unexpected. Emily lowered her gaze toward the music stand and gently closed the score, her composure unchanged from the moment she had stepped forward. The students remained frozen in their seats as they tried to process what they had just heard. Lydia Grant, who had struggled with the aria earlier, stared at Emily with open disbelief, as though the quiet assistant she had passed in the hallway every week had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. A student near the back whispered softly that the control in that performance sounded like recordings they had studied from famous European opera houses. Another student shook their head slowly, unable to reconcile the elegant performance with the image of the woman who usually arrived early to organize rehearsal folders and prepare the room for class. Victor Harrington remained beside the piano without speaking. His eyes had not left Emily since the moment her first note had filled the room. For someone who had spent decades analyzing voices across the world's most demanding stages, the performance he had just heard carried unmistakable signs of professional mastery. The breath management, the subtle emotional interpretation, the natural authority in the high register were qualities that could not be improvised in a moment of courage. They came only from years of disciplined experience. The instructor finally cleared his throat quietly, though the gesture sounded louder than expected in the silent studio. The students turned their attention toward him, waiting for the reaction that would define what had just happened. Yet Victor did not deliver the sharp critique or confident explanation they were accustomed to hearing. Instead, he studied Emily carefully, as though attempting to place a memory that remained just beyond reach. Emily stepped slightly away from the music stand and folded her hands calmly in front of her. There was no sign of pride or dramatic acknowledgement in her posture. She appeared as composed as she had been when arranging sheet music earlier that afternoon. The difference now was the unmistakable shift in how every person in the room looked at her. The quiet assistant who had once blended into the background of the conservatory was now the center of every thought inside Studio B. Victor finally spoke, his voice slower than usual as he chose his words with unusual care. "Miss Carter," he said, "how long have you been studying opera?" The question hung in the air, carrying a weight that none of the students had expected to hear from the famously confident instructor. Victor Harrington's question lingered in the quiet studio like a note that had not fully resolved. Every student waited for Emily Carter to answer, yet she did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced down briefly at the closed score resting on the piano stand, as though acknowledging the music one last time before returning to the room around her. When she finally lifted her eyes, her expression remained calm and thoughtful. "I studied many years ago," she said gently. Her voice carried the same natural steadiness that had filled the aria moments earlier. The simplicity of the answer only deepened the curiosity in the room. Victor tilted his head slightly, studying her more carefully now. "Many years ago is not very specific," he replied, though his tone no longer carried the playful confidence it had earlier. One of the students shifted forward in their chair and asked quietly whether Emily had trained somewhere in the United States. Emily offered a small polite smile, as if the attention still felt unfamiliar. "My training was mostly in Europe," she explained softly. Several students exchanged surprised glances. European conservatories were known for their rigorous traditions and selective programs. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, as if a distant memory had begun to surface. "Europe," he repeated slowly. "Which city?" Emily paused for a moment, perhaps deciding how much to say. "Vienna," she answered at last. The name seemed to ripple across the room with immediate recognition. Even students early in their training understood the significance of Vienna in the world of classical music. Victor Harrington's posture changed almost imperceptibly. He stepped a little closer to the piano, his attention sharpening with professional curiosity. "Vienna produces many excellent singers," he said carefully. "Did you study at the conservatory there?" Emily nodded once. "Yes, many years ago." The quiet response created a new silence in the studio, one filled not with doubt, but with growing realization. A student near the front of the room suddenly leaned toward their classmate and whispered something urgent. Victor noticed the reaction and turned his gaze back to Emily. "Forgive the question," he said slowly, "but were you ever performing professionally?" Emily hesitated this time. The question seemed to carry memories she had not expected to revisit that afternoon. For a brief moment, she simply looked around the rehearsal studio, taking in the curious faces of students who had only known her as the woman who prepared rehearsal spaces and organized sheet music carts. Then she answered quietly, "Yes." The single word changed the atmosphere inside Studio B once again. Victor felt the final pieces of a forgotten memory begin to fall into place. Years earlier, during one of his own international tours, there had been conversations among opera circles about a young soprano from Vienna whose performances had drawn remarkable attention before she suddenly disappeared from the stage. At the time, many people had speculated about why such a promising career would vanish so quickly. Victor studied Emily's face with growing certainty. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, his voice no longer carrying any hint of amusement, "may I ask what name you performed under when you were singing in Vienna?" The students leaned forward instinctively, sensing that the answer might explain everything they had just witnessed. Emily Carter stood quietly as Victor Harrington's question settled over the room. Every student in Studio B leaned forward slightly, sensing that the answer might reveal the final piece of a mystery none of them had expected to encounter that afternoon. Emily looked toward the tall windows of the rehearsal hall for a moment, as though searching through years of memories that had remained untouched for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and thoughtful. "I performed under my full name," she said softly. "Emily Carter." The reaction in the room was not immediate applause or excitement. Instead, there was a ripple of quiet confusion among the students. Many of them were still early in their training and had not yet studied the history of recent opera performances in detail. But Victor Harrington's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened slightly as recognition finally arrived with undeniable clarity. He took a slow step back from the piano, studying her face as though confirming something he had once seen years earlier in another place entirely. "Emily Carter," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. The name carried weight in his memory. Nearly a decade earlier, opera critics across Europe had written about a young American soprano who had trained in Vienna and stunned audiences with an extraordinary debut performance at a renowned festival. Her voice had been described as unusually expressive, powerful yet refined, with a rare ability to carry emotional depth through even the most demanding repertoire. Then, just as quickly as her reputation had begun to rise, she had disappeared from the international stage. Opera houses had quietly removed her name from upcoming programs, and speculation about her sudden absence had spread through music circles without ever reaching a clear answer. Victor had been performing in Italy during that period and remembered hearing the conversations among musicians backstage. Many had wondered why such a promising voice would simply vanish. Now he stood inside a rehearsal studio in New York City, looking at the same woman who had just sung one of Verdi's most challenging arias with effortless mastery while wearing the simple cardigan of a conservatory assistant. The realization seemed to travel across the room slowly as Victor spoke again, this time louder so that the class could hear him clearly. "Several years ago, there was a soprano performing in Vienna whose recordings were studied in master classes across Europe," he said carefully. "Her debut at the summer festival was considered one of the most remarkable performances of that season." Victor paused briefly, allowing the memory to settle before finishing the thought. Her name was Emily Carter. The students turned back toward the quiet woman standing beside the piano, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment. One student whispered that they had heard a recording from that festival during a music history seminar. Another student quietly searched through their memory, suddenly recalling the same name mentioned by a visiting lecturer the previous semester. Emily did not react dramatically to the recognition spreading through the room. She simply folded her hands gently in front of her again, the same calm posture she had held earlier while organizing sheet music. Victor Harrington shook his head slowly, still absorbing the reality of what had just unfolded in his classroom. The voice he had heard moments ago was no mystery at all. It belonged to a singer whose talent had once captured the attention of the entire European opera community before quietly disappearing from public view. The name hung in the air like the final chord of a symphony. For several seconds no one in Studio B spoke. The students who had been whispering earlier now stared openly at Emily Carter as the realization slowly spread through the room. The quiet assistant who organized rehearsal folders and cleaned music stands was the same soprano whose voice had once drawn standing ovations from audiences across Europe. One student in the second row suddenly remembered the recording Victor had mentioned. During a seminar the previous semester, a visiting conductor had played a performance from the Vienna Summer Festival and described the young soprano as one of the most promising voices of her generation. Another student whispered that the interpretation of Verdi they had just heard sounded exactly like the recording from that lecture. The pieces began falling together with quiet astonishment. Victor Harrington remained beside the piano, absorbing the moment with a mixture of surprise and professional respect. For years he had heard stories about the mysterious disappearance of that remarkable soprano. No official explanation had ever been given. Some critics believed she had chosen to step away from the pressure of international touring. Others had speculated about health issues or private family matters. Yet none of those theories had ever been confirmed, and over time the opera world had simply moved on. Victor looked back toward Emily, who still stood with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the entire class. "You left the stage very suddenly," he said quietly. "I remember hearing that several opera houses had scheduled you for major roles the following season." His tone was no longer that of a demanding instructor, but of a musician speaking to another professional whose choices he genuinely wished to understand. Emily listened without interruption. When she finally spoke, her answer was simple and sincere. Life sometimes leads people in directions they do not expect. The room remained silent as she continued. "My mother became ill during that time," she explained gently. "She had always supported my music from the very beginning, even when I was a student struggling to afford lessons. When she needed someone close to her, I decided that the stage could wait." Several students lowered their eyes respectfully, understanding the quiet weight behind her words. Emily offered a small, thoughtful smile before continuing. "By the time things settled again, I realized that I no longer felt the same urgency to return to the spotlight. Music still mattered deeply to me, but I began to appreciate the quieter spaces around it as well. Helping students prepare their scores, listening to rehearsals, watching new singers discover their voices. Those moments carried their own kind of meaning." Victor nodded slowly as the explanation settled in. The students who had once assumed Emily was simply part of the background now understood that the woman standing beside the piano had chosen a different path rather than losing her place in the world of opera. One student in the front row spoke softly, asking the question that many others were thinking. "Do you ever miss performing on stage?" Emily considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted with a gentle laugh. "Especially when I hear a beautiful orchestra warming up in a concert hall. But music does not disappear just because the audience cannot see you. It stays with you. And sometimes it appears again when you least expect it." As the meaning of her words settled across the room, the students realized that the remarkable performance they had just witnessed had not been a rare accident. It had been the quiet return of a voice that had never truly gone away. The quiet conversation faded and a thoughtful stillness settled over Studio B once again. For the students sitting in that rehearsal room, the afternoon had transformed into something none of them would ever forget. Only an hour earlier they had been focused on technique drills, vocal warm-ups, and the familiar pressure of impressing a demanding instructor. Now they found themselves sitting in front of a woman whose voice had once filled some of the most respected concert halls in Europe, a singer they had unknowingly passed in the hallway every week, while carrying rehearsal folders or organizing sheet music. Victor Harrington looked across the room at his students, many of whom were still processing what they had just learned. The confident authority that usually defined his teaching had softened, replaced by a rare moment of reflection. "Music," he said slowly, "has a way of reminding us that talent does not always stand in the center of the stage. Sometimes it waits quietly in the wings." The students listened closely, understanding that the lesson unfolding in front of them had nothing to do with scales or pronunciation or vocal range. It was something far deeper than technique. Victor turned back toward Emily Carter with a respectful nod that carried none of the earlier amusement. "Miss Carter," he said, "I believe this class owes you more than a moment of silence. A few students began to clap hesitantly, unsure if the gesture was appropriate, but the sound quickly spread across the room until every person in the studio joined in. The applause was not loud or theatrical. It was genuine appreciation from young singers who had just witnessed what dedication to music truly looked like. Emily accepted the reaction with a gentle smile and a small nod of gratitude. She did not step forward or attempt to reclaim the center of the room. Instead, she returned to the simple card of sheet music near the wall where she had begun the afternoon. The students watched with quiet respect as she resumed organizing the scores with the same calm attention she had shown before the class began. The remarkable voice that had filled the room only minutes earlier now belonged once again to the quiet presence who helped prepare their rehearsals each week. Yet something inside the studio had changed. The students no longer saw the assistant who arranged their practice materials. They saw a musician whose journey had taken unexpected paths, yet never truly separated her from the music she loved. Victor Harrington observed the scene for a moment longer before addressing the class once more. "Every singer here dreams about the stage," he said thoughtfully. "But the real measure of an artist is not how brightly they shine in the spotlight. It is how deeply the music lives inside them even when no one is watching." The room grew quiet again as the meaning of his words settled in. Emily Carter finished, arranging the final stack of sheet music, and gently rolled the cart toward the hallway. Before leaving, she glanced back briefly at the students who were now watching her with a completely different understanding. For them, the lesson of that afternoon would remain long after the technical exercises of the semester were forgotten. Because on that quiet day inside a rehearsal studio in New York City, they had witnessed something rare. A reminder that true talent does not need attention to exist. It simply waits for the right moment to be heard.